In the annals of human courage, there exist stories that transcend the boundaries of ordinary heroism, tales that speak to the very essence of what it means to protect, to endure, and to transform through adversity. This is one such story, a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war, the profound strength found in unexpected guardianship, and the ultimate truth that those who conquer their inner weaknesses become unconquerable by any external force. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small forward operating base in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, where Staff Sergeant Michael Chen lay unconscious in the makeshift medical tent. His body bore the marks of 7 separate wounds sustained during a patrol that had gone catastrophically wrong 3 days earlier. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through his left shoulder and chest, a sniper's bullet had grazed his skull, leaving him with a severe concussion. Fragments from a mortar round had peppered his right leg, and burns from a secondary explosion had scarred his arms. The medics had done what they could, but resources were limited, and evacuation to a proper hospital remained impossible due to ongoing combat operations in the area. It was then that Amara appeared. She was not a soldier, not a medic, not even an official member of any military organization. Amara was a local woman, perhaps in her early 30s, though the harsh realities of life in a war zone had etched lines of premature aging around her dark eyes. Her village had been destroyed in the fighting weeks earlier, her family scattered or lost, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and an inexplicable determination to help wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality or allegiance. The other Marines at the base initially viewed her with suspicion and uncertainty. In a region where trust was a luxury few could afford, where every civilian could potentially be an enemy combatant, her sudden appearance and insistence on caring for their wounded comrade seemed almost too fortuitous to believe. Captain Rodriguez, the commanding officer, had ordered background checks and constant surveillance, but, as days passed without incident, and as Chen's condition began to stabilize under her care, a grudging acceptance began to take hold. Amara possessed an almost mystical understanding of healing that seemed to transcend formal medical training. She knew which desert plants could be ground into poultices that reduced inflammation and prevented infection. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had tended to countless wounds, her voice carried the soothing cadence of natural comfort, and her presence seemed to emanate a calm that affected not just Chen but every Marine who entered the medical tent. For 17 days and nights, she never left his side. When fever racked his body, she placed cool, damp cloths on his forehead and whispered words in her native Pashto that seemed to pull him back from the brink of delirium. When infection threatened to claim his wounded leg, she applied herbal treatments that somehow proved more effective than the limited antibiotics available at the base. When nightmares caused him to thrash violently in his sleep, potentially reopening his wounds, she would place a gentle hand on his chest and hum melodies that seemed to reach into his subconscious and bring peace. The other Marines began to notice changes not just in Chen's physical condition, but in themselves as well. The constant stress and hypervigilance that defined their daily existence seemed to ease somewhat in Amara's presence. Hardened soldiers found themselves speaking more quietly, moving with less aggressive urgency, and treating one another with increased consideration. It was as if her commitment to healing had created a small bubble of humanity within the harsh mechanical reality of warfare. During the long hours of her vigil, Amara would speak to the unconscious Chen in a mixture of Pashto, broken English, and sometimes simply in the universal language of human compassion. She told him about her lost village, about the children she had taught to read before the war consumed everything, about her dreams of peace and rebuilding. She spoke of strength not as the absence of fear or pain, but as the willingness to endure both while continuing to care for others. Her words seemed to penetrate the fog of his injured consciousness, becoming threads that helped weave him back together not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. On the 18th day, Chen finally opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Amara's face, creased with exhaustion but illuminated by relief and joy. His first instinct was to reach for his weapon, the trained response of a soldier awakening in potentially hostile territory, but something in her expression stopped him. There was no threat here, no danger except perhaps to the hardened shell he had built around his heart during months of combat. Recovery was slow and painful. Each of his 7 wounds required careful attention and gradual rehabilitation. The shoulder injury had damaged nerves that controlled fine motor function in his left arm. The head trauma had left him with persistent headaches and occasional episodes of dizziness. The leg wounds made walking a laborious and agonizing process. Yet through every setback, every moment of frustration and despair, Amara remained constant in her encouragement and care. She taught him exercises that stretched beyond mere physical therapy. As his body healed, she challenged him to examine the wounds that could not be seen, the psychological scars that every combat veteran carries, the guilt over comrades lost, the anger at a world that seemed indifferent to suffering, the fear that he might never again be the man he was before the injuries. These conversations often lasted deep into the night, conducted in whispered tones that would not disturb others sleeping nearby. It was during one such conversation that Chen began to understand what Amara meant when she spoke of destroying one's weak self. She did not mean eliminating vulnerability or sensitivity, which many soldiers mistakenly believed was the path to strength. Instead, she meant recognizing and overcoming the parts of oneself that prevented growth, that insisted on maintaining old patterns of thinking and being even when those patterns no longer served any useful purpose. For Chen, this weak self manifested as an inability to accept help from others, a stubborn pride that insisted he must bear all burdens alone, and a deep-seated belief that showing any form of emotional openness was tantamount to admitting failure. These characteristics had served him well in certain aspects of military life, but they had also isolated him from meaningful human connection and prevented him from accessing the full range of his own strength and resilience. Under Amara's patient guidance, he began to dismantle these limiting beliefs piece by piece. He learned to accept assistance without viewing it as a sign of weakness. He discovered that vulnerability, when shared with someone trustworthy, became a source of strength rather than a liability. Most importantly, he began to understand that true courage was not the absence of fear or pain, but the willingness to face both while continuing to move forward with purpose and compassion. As his physical recovery progressed, Chen also began to observe the effect that Amara's presence had on the other Marines at the base. These were men who had been hardened by months of combat, who had seen friends killed and wounded, who had been forced to make split-second decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet in the small circle of influence surrounding the medical tent, a different dynamic had emerged. Sergeant Williams, a demolitions expert who had become increasingly isolated and irritable following a particularly devastating patrol, began to open up about his struggles with survivor's guilt. Corporal Jackson, known for his hair-trigger temper and tendency toward violence, started to exhibit more patience and consideration in his interactions with local civilians. Even Captain Rodriguez, burdened by the weight of command and the constant pressure of keeping his men alive, seemed to find moments of peace and reflection that had been absent from his demeanor for months. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. It was as if Amara's example of selfless service and her gentle insistence on seeing the humanity in everyone she encountered had created ripples that spread outward, affecting the entire unit in positive ways. The Marines began to treat one another with increased respect and compassion. Their interactions with local civilians became more considerate and patient. Even their approach to combat operations seemed to incorporate a greater awareness of the human cost of their actions. This change did not escape the attention of higher command. Reports from the forward operating base noted decreased incidents of interpersonal conflict among the troops, improved relations with local civilians, and more effective intelligence gathering due to increased trust from the community. What the official reports could not capture was the more profound transformation that was taking place, the gradual evolution of a group of warriors who were learning to integrate their strength with their humanity. The turning point came on the 32nd day of Chen's recovery. Intelligence had indicated that a large Taliban force was planning a coordinated attack on the base, using insider knowledge that suggested someone within the local community was providing detailed information about Marine positions and patrol routes. Suspicion immediately fell on Amara, whose presence at the base and intimate knowledge of its operations made her an obvious candidate for investigation. Captain Rodriguez was faced with an impossible decision. Military protocol demanded that he detain and interrogate anyone who might pose a security risk, regardless of their apparent contributions to the welfare of his men. Yet the thought of treating Amara as a potential enemy seemed to violate everything he had learned about honor and justice during his weeks of observing her selfless dedication to healing. The investigation that followed was thorough and professional, but also respectful and considerate in ways that surprised everyone involved. Rather than employing the harsh interrogation techniques that might normally be used with suspected enemy operatives, the Marines approached Amara with the same respect they would show a fellow service member. They explained their concerns clearly, asked for her cooperation in helping them understand the security breach, and made it clear that their investigation was driven by necessity rather than suspicion of her character. Amara's response revealed the depth of her wisdom and strength. Rather than becoming defensive or angry at the implied accusations, she calmly explained her understanding of the situation and offered to do whatever was necessary to help protect the Marines she had come to care about. She provided detailed information about her background, her family connections, and her movements during the weeks she had been at the base. More importantly, she offered insights into local customs and communication patterns that helped the investigators identify the actual source of the security leak. The real culprit turned out to be a local interpreter who had been coerced into providing information under threat to his family. The discovery not only cleared Amara of suspicion but also demonstrated the accuracy of her character assessment and the value of treating people with respect and dignity even under difficult circumstances. The resolution of the investigation marked a turning point in how the entire unit understood the relationship between strength and compassion. As Chen's recovery progressed toward completion, both he and the other Marines began to grapple with the reality that their time with Amara would eventually come to an end. Chen would need to return to active duty or accept medical retirement, depending on the extent of his recovery. The unit would likely be reassigned to other areas of operation. Amara herself had begun to speak of her desire to return to the work of rebuilding her community and helping other refugees find new homes and purposes. The impending separation forced everyone to confront the question of how the lessons they had learned would survive the transition back to normal military operations. It was one thing to practice compassion and wisdom within the protected environment that Amara had created around the medical tent. It would be quite another to maintain those principles while facing the harsh realities of active combat. This challenge led to what Chen later described as the most important conversation of his life. Sitting outside the medical tent during one of the clear, star-filled nights that were among the few beautiful aspects of the desert environment, he and Amara discussed the nature of true strength and the process of personal transformation that he had undergone during his recovery. Amara explained that the destruction of one's weak self was not a one-time event but an ongoing process that required constant attention and commitment. The weak self had a tendency to reassert itself during times of stress or uncertainty, trying to convince the individual that old patterns of thinking and behavior were safer and more reliable than the new approaches they had learned. True strength, therefore, lay not in achieving a state of permanent enlightenment, but in developing the discipline to consistently choose growth over comfort, compassion over indifference, and courage over fear. She told him that the 7 wounds he had sustained were not just physical injuries to be healed, but also symbolic representations of the 7 aspects of weakness that every person must overcome in order to achieve their full potential. The first wound, to his shoulder, represented the burden of carrying responsibilities alone rather than accepting help from others. The second, to his chest, symbolized the protection of his heart from emotional connection and vulnerability. The third, his head injury, reflected the mental patterns that limited his ability to see new possibilities and solutions. The remaining wounds corresponded to other aspects of human weakness, the inability to stand firmly on one's own principles, the tendency to lash out when hurt rather than seeking understanding, the habit of hiding behind defensive barriers rather than engaging authentically with the world, and the fear of change that prevented growth and adaptation. By healing these wounds both physically and symbolically, Chen had demonstrated the possibility of transforming weakness into strength through conscious effort and the support of caring relationships. This conversation continued over several nights, during which Amara shared stories and wisdom from her own culture about the nature of strength and resilience. She spoke of warriors in her tradition who were honored not for their ability to kill enemies, but for their capacity to protect the innocent and maintain their humanity even in the face of terrible circumstances. She described the concept of jihad not as it had been corrupted by extremists, but in its original meaning as the struggle against one's own lower impulses and the effort to become a better person. These discussions had a profound impact not only on Chen but on the other Marines who gradually joined these evening conversations. They began to understand that true strength was not about dominating others or suppressing their own emotions, but about developing the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy, when to be hard and when to be gentle, when to lead and when to follow. The practical application of these insights became apparent during the final weeks of Chen's recovery, when the unit was involved in several complex operations that required both military effectiveness and cultural sensitivity. The Marines found that their improved understanding of human nature and their increased capacity for empathy actually made them more effective soldiers rather than less. They were able to gather better intelligence because local civilians trusted them more. They made fewer tactical errors because they were better at reading the emotions and intentions of the people around them. Most importantly, they maintained their sense of purpose and moral clarity even in situations that might previously have led to cynicism or emotional numbness. The culmination of this transformation came during Chen's final medical evaluation, when it was determined that he had recovered sufficiently to return to active duty. The decision was his to make. He could accept assignment to a new unit and continue his military career, or he could accept medical retirement and begin the transition to civilian life. Either choice would mean leaving behind the protective environment where he had learned so much about himself and his potential for growth. Chen chose to remain in the military, but with a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. He requested assignment to a position where he could help train other soldiers not just in tactical skills, but in the mental and emotional resilience necessary for effective service. He wanted to share what he had learned about the relationship between personal strength and the ability to serve others with honor and effectiveness. The night before his departure, the entire unit gathered for an informal ceremony that had been organized spontaneously by the enlisted men. It was not an official military function, but rather a personal acknowledgement of the transformation that had taken place among them during the weeks of Chen's recovery. Each Marine spoke briefly about how his experience with Amara and Chen's recovery had affected his own understanding of strength and service. Sergeant Williams talked about how he had learned to accept help in dealing with his survivor's guilt, and how that acceptance had actually made him a more effective leader rather than a weaker one. Corporal Jackson described his discovery that controlling his temper required more strength than giving in to it, and how that control had improved his relationships with both fellow Marines and local civilians. Captain Rodriguez spoke about the challenge of maintaining compassion while making life and death decisions, and how that balance had become central to his understanding of effective command. The ceremony was simple and informal, but it marked a significant moment in the lives of everyone present. These were hardened combat veterans who had learned to express emotion sparingly and to view vulnerability as a liability. Yet in that moment, they found themselves able to acknowledge the profound changes they had undergone and to express gratitude for the woman who had made those changes possible. Amara's response was characteristically humble and wise. She reminded them that the strength they had discovered was not something she had given them, but rather something they had always possessed and had simply learned to access more fully. The real test of their growth would come not in the protected environment of their small base, but in the months and years ahead as they faced new challenges and temptations to revert to old patterns of behavior. She told them that the Marines who would arrive to replace their unit would face the same challenges they had faced, and would have the same opportunities for growth if they were willing to recognize and seize them. The legacy of what had been learned at this small forward operating base would live on not in official reports or commendations, but in the choices that each of them made every day to be stronger, wiser, and more compassionate human beings. The departure itself was conducted with military efficiency and typical understatement. Chen was loaded onto a helicopter that would take him to the larger base where he would begin the process of reassignment. His personal belongings fit into a single duffel bag, and the official paperwork documenting his recovery filled only a few pages. Yet everyone present understood that what was really being transported was far more significant than could be captured in any official record. As the helicopter lifted off, Chen watched the small base shrink into the vast expanse of the Afghan desert. From the air, it looked insignificant, just another temporary military installation in a landscape marked by countless years of conflict. Yet he knew that within the boundaries of that small outpost, something extraordinary had taken place, a demonstration that even in the midst of war, it was possible to find and nurture the best qualities of human nature. The flight to the larger base gave him time to reflect on the weeks of his recovery and to consider how he would apply what he had learned in his new assignment. He understood that the easy part was over. Living according to the principles Amara had taught him while surrounded by her calming presence and the support of his transformed unit had been challenging enough. Maintaining those principles while dealing with new people, new stressors, and new temptations would require a different kind of strength entirely. The weeks that followed were indeed difficult. Chen's new assignment involved training recruits who were preparing for their first deployments to combat zones. These young Marines were eager, aggressive, and filled with the kind of bravado that Chen himself had once mistaken for true strength. Their tendency to solve problems through force, their impatience with nuance and complexity, and their belief that showing emotion was a sign of weakness all reminded him of his own attitudes before his injuries and recovery. His initial attempts to share what he had learned were met with skepticism and resistance. The recruits wanted to learn how to be more effective killers, not more effective human beings. His suggestions about the importance of emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and moral reflection were dismissed as irrelevant complications that would only interfere with their primary mission of engaging and defeating the enemy. It was during this period of frustration and apparent failure that Chen began to truly understand what Amara had meant about the ongoing nature of personal transformation. The temptation to revert to his old patterns of behavior was strong, especially when it seemed like the easier path would be to simply give the recruits what they expected rather than what he believed they needed. The weak self that he thought he had overcome began to whisper that his new insights were impractical, that the military was not the place for such philosophical concerns, that he should focus on tactical training and leave the deeper questions to others. It was then that he remembered Amara's words about the Marines who would come after them. Perhaps his role was not to transform every recruit he encountered, but to plant seeds that might grow over time, especially when those young Marines faced their own moments of crisis and questioning. Perhaps the real measure of success was not immediate acceptance of his teachings, but the gradual development of men and women who would be better prepared to maintain their humanity under extreme stress. This realization led to a subtle but important shift in his approach. Rather than lecturing about abstract principles, he began to share specific stories from his deployment, focusing on situations where cultural awareness, emotional intelligence, and moral clarity had made the difference between mission success and failure. He talked about how understanding local customs had prevented unnecessary conflicts, how reading people's emotions had provided crucial intelligence, how maintaining ethical standards had earned the trust necessary for effective operations. Gradually, some of the recruits began to listen more carefully. They started to ask questions about how to balance aggression with restraint, how to maintain focus while remaining aware of broader contexts, how to be strong without becoming callous. These conversations often took place during informal moments, while cleaning equipment, during breaks in training, over meals in the dining facility rather than in formal classroom settings. Chen also began to notice changes in himself that reflected his continued growth. He found that he was more patient with difficult recruits, more creative in finding ways to communicate complex ideas, more willing to admit when he didn't know something rather than pretending to have all the answers. The process of teaching was itself a form of learning that deepened his understanding of the principles Amara had shared with him. 6 months into his new assignment, Chen received news that would test his commitment to his transformed understanding of strength and service. Intelligence reports indicated that Amara had been killed during a Taliban attack on a refugee camp where she had been working. The reports were sketchy and unconfirmed, but they suggested that she had died while trying to protect wounded civilians from being executed by extremist fighters. The news hit Chen like a physical blow, bringing back all the pain and helplessness he had felt during his own injuries. His first impulse was to request immediate reassignment to a combat unit so that he could seek revenge against those responsible for her death. The weak self that he thought he had overcome reasserted itself with vicious intensity, whispering that all his efforts at personal growth had been meaningless, that the only real strength lay in the ability to destroy one's enemies. For several days, he struggled with these emotions while maintaining his training responsibilities. He found himself short-tempered with recruits, cynical about the possibility of positive change, and increasingly isolated from his colleagues. The transformation that had seemed so complete and permanent began to feel fragile and artificial, as if it had been nothing more than a temporary delusion brought on by unusual circumstances. It was during this dark period that something unexpected happened. Several of the recruits he had been training approached him individually to express their concern about his obvious distress. These young Marines, whom he had often viewed as too immature or self-centered to truly understand the lessons he was trying to teach, demonstrated a level of emotional awareness and genuine caring that surprised him. They didn't know the specifics of what was troubling him, but they recognized that someone they had come to respect was in pain, and they wanted to help. Their concern forced Chen to confront the extent to which his own teachings had been internalized not just by himself, but by those around him. The seeds he had thought were falling on barren ground had actually been taking root, creating a small but growing community of people who understood that true strength included the willingness to support one another through difficult times. This recognition led to a breakthrough in his understanding of Amara's legacy. She had not died in vain, nor had her teachings been lost with her physical death. Every person she had touched during her brief time at the forward operating base carried some part of her wisdom forward into their own interactions with others. Chen himself was living proof of this continuity, as were the recruits who were now showing him the same kind of compassionate concern that she had demonstrated during his recovery. The realization that Amara's influence was continuing to spread through his own efforts, and through the efforts of countless others who had learned from her example, gave Chen the strength to overcome his grief and anger. He understood that the best way to honor her memory was not through seeking revenge, but through continuing to embody and teach the principles she had lived by. The weak self that demanded immediate satisfaction through violence was ultimately less powerful than the strong self that committed to long-term positive change through patient and persistent effort. This insight marked the beginning of the final phase of Chen's transformation. Over the months that followed, he developed increasingly sophisticated methods for helping recruits understand the relationship between personal strength and effective service. He created training scenarios that required not just tactical skill, but also cultural sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and moral reasoning. He brought in guest speakers who could share diverse perspectives on conflict resolution, community building, and cross-cultural communication. Most importantly, he began to identify and mentor recruits who showed particular aptitude for this more holistic approach to military service. These were often individuals who had experienced their own challenges and setbacks, who had learned through personal struggle that true strength required more than physical prowess or aggressive determination. Under his guidance, they began to develop their own capacity to teach and lead others toward a more complete understanding of what it meant to be a warrior in the modern world. The impact of this approach became evident during evaluations of the units that included Chen's former trainees. Reports consistently noted higher levels of unit cohesion, better relationships with local civilians in deployment areas, more effective intelligence gathering, and fewer incidents of misconduct or disciplinary problems. These practical results provided concrete validation that the seemingly abstract principles Amara had taught were actually highly relevant to military effectiveness. Word of Chen's innovative training methods began to spread throughout the military education system. He was invited to speak at conferences, to contribute to training manuals, and to consult on the development of new curricula for military schools. Yet he remained humble about these achievements, always attributing his insights to the woman who had taught him during his recovery, and always emphasizing that true strength was measured not by personal recognition or career advancement, but by one's contribution to the growth and well-being of others. 3 years after his departure from the forward operating base in Afghanistan, Chen received an unexpected message that would provide the final confirmation of the enduring power of Amara's teachings. A young Marine lieutenant named Sarah Martinez had tracked down his contact information because she had heard about his work from one of her instructors at the Naval Academy. She was writing her senior thesis on moral leadership in military contexts, and she wanted to interview him about his experiences and methods. During their conversation, Lieutenant Martinez mentioned that her interest in this topic had been sparked by stories she had heard about a legendary figure known among Marines as the woman who saved the wounded warrior. According to these stories, which had apparently spread throughout the Corps through informal networks and word-of-mouth transmission, there had once been a civilian woman who had demonstrated such extraordinary compassion and wisdom while caring for injured Marines that she had transformed not just individual soldiers, but entire units. The stories varied in their details, as such tales inevitably do when passed from person to person over time. Some versions portrayed Amara as almost supernatural in her healing abilities. Others focused more on the psychological and spiritual transformation of the Marines she had influenced. But all the stories shared certain common elements: the woman's selfless dedication to healing, her ability to help warriors discover strength through vulnerability, and her teaching that true power came from conquering one's own weaknesses rather than dominating others. Chen realized that Amara had become something more than just a memory. She had become a symbol and inspiration for an entire generation of Marines who were seeking to understand what it meant to serve with honor in an increasingly complex world. The lessons she had taught during her brief time at one small forward operating base were now being shared, discussed, and applied by military personnel whom she had never met and would never meet. Lieutenant Martinez's thesis, which was later published and widely distributed throughout military academic circles, helped to formalize and systematize many of the insights that had emerged from Chen's recovery experience. Her work provided a theoretical framework for understanding how personal transformation related to military effectiveness, how emotional intelligence enhanced rather than diminished warrior capabilities, and how moral strength served as a foundation for tactical and strategic success. The publication of her thesis marked a turning point in official military thinking about the relationship between character development and professional competence. Training programs began to incorporate elements that address not just technical skills, but also emotional resilience, cultural awareness, and ethical reasoning. The integration of these components was gradual and sometimes met with resistance, but the practical benefits were undeniable. Chen's own career continued to evolve in directions that reflected his commitment to this more comprehensive approach to military service. He eventually became the commandant of a major training facility, where he was able to implement systematic changes that affected thousands of Marines during their formative period of professional development. His leadership style, which combined high standards with genuine care for individual growth, became a model that was studied and emulated throughout the military education system. Yet despite his professional success and recognition, Chen never forgot the fundamental truth that Amara had taught him, that the measure of a person's strength was not their ability to overcome external challenges, but their willingness to face and transform their own internal limitations. This principle guided not just his professional decisions, but his personal relationships, his approach to parenthood when he eventually started a family, and his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The final validation of Amara's teachings came nearly a decade after Chen's recovery, when he received news that a group of Marines serving in a conflict zone had encountered a situation that directly paralleled his own experience. A local woman had appeared at their forward operating base, seeking to care for wounded soldiers despite the obvious risks to her own safety. The Marines, some of whom had been trained by Chen or by instructors who had learned from him, recognized the parallel to the legendary story of the woman who had saved the wounded warrior. Rather than viewing the woman with suspicion or treating her as a potential security threat, they approached the situation with openness and respect. They allowed her to contribute to the care of their wounded comrade, learned from her knowledge of local healing practices, and created an environment where mutual trust could develop. The result was not just the successful recovery of the wounded Marine, but the establishment of positive relationships with the local community that led to improved security and more effective operations throughout their deployment. The report of this incident, which made its way through official channels to Chen's desk, provided concrete evidence that the lessons learned during his own recovery had become an integral part of Marine Corps culture. The story that had begun with Amara's compassionate care for one wounded warrior had evolved into a systematic approach to military service that honored both strength and humanity. As Chen reflected on the journey that had brought him from a wounded and isolated soldier to a leader whose influence extended far beyond his immediate sphere of responsibility, he understood that the true power of Amara's teachings lay not in their originality or complexity, but in their fundamental truth and practical applicability. She had not invented new concepts of strength and service, she had simply demonstrated ancient wisdom in a context where it could be seen, understood, and applied by people who desperately needed guidance. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This truth, which Amara had embodied so completely and taught so effectively, had become more than a personal philosophy for Chen. It had become a way of understanding the relationship between individual growth and collective strength. A military force composed of individuals who had learned to conquer their own fears, prejudices, and limitations was infinitely more powerful than any army that relied solely on superior weapons or tactical advantage. The story of the woman who protected a soldier through 7 wounds had become the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. It was a story that honored both the courage required to face external enemies and the wisdom needed to overcome internal obstacles. It was a testament to the truth that real strength was not about the ability to inflict harm, but about the capacity to heal, protect, and inspire others to become their best selves. In the years that followed, Chen would often return in his mind to those crucial weeks of recovery, when pain and vulnerability had been transformed into wisdom and strength through the patient care of an extraordinary woman. He would remember the sound of her voice as she spoke words of encouragement during his darkest moments, the gentle touch of her hands as she tended to his wounds, and the profound peace that seemed to emanate from her presence even in the midst of a war zone. But, most of all, he would remember the lesson that had become the cornerstone of his life, that true invincibility came not from being untouchable, but from being unbreakable, not from avoiding all wounds, but from learning to heal completely, not from destroying all enemies, but from conquering the only enemy that really mattered, the weak and fearful self that prevented growth, connection, and service to others. The Marines who showed up in silence to honor this story understood what Chen himself had learned, that some victories cannot be measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but only in lives transformed and wisdom passed on. They came to pay tribute not just to the woman who had saved one warrior, but to the eternal truth she had demonstrated, that the greatest strength is found in service to others, and that those who learn to defeat their own weaknesses become truly unconquerable. In the end, the story of Amara and Staff Sergeant Michael Chen became more than a tale of one woman's compassion or one man's recovery. It became a legend that captured the highest ideals of military service, the protection of the innocent, the care of the wounded, the pursuit of justice, and the constant striving to become worthy of the trust placed in those who serve. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, it is possible to find light, even in the midst of destruction, it is possible to create something beautiful, and even when wounded and broken, it is possible to emerge stronger than before. The 7 wounds that Chen had suffered in body had been healed through Amara's care, but the 7 wounds to his spirit, fear, pride, isolation, anger, despair, cynicism, and weakness had been transformed into their opposites: courage, humility, connection, peace, hope, faith, and strength. This transformation had not made him invulnerable to future injury or immune to future challenges, but it had given him the tools to face whatever might come with confidence and grace. And, in teaching others to achieve their own transformation, in creating systems and cultures that supported the development of both outer strength and inner wisdom, Chen had ensured that Amara's legacy would continue to spread far beyond anything she could have imagined during those quiet nights when she sat beside a wounded warrior and whispered words of healing into the darkness. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This truth had become not just a personal achievement, but a gift to be shared with all who had the courage to receive it. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.